Energy disruptors. Please welcome to the stage Alex Epstein, founder for Industrial Progress and author The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels.
When I was 20 years old, I made a life decision that would seem to make me the world's least qualified person to talk at this conference. And that was, I decided that I was going to become a philosopher. Now, being a philosopher is usually considered the world's most useless profession. Like, how many times in your life, particularly if you're in energy, have you thought, oh, I know what's going to solve my problem, it's going to be a philosopher. It's very, very unusual. But I actually think it's really, really important. And a couple years ago, I was testifying in front of the US Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and I'm from California, so my senator at the time was Barbara Boxer, and she definitely did not think that I belonged there, but I tried to explain to her very quickly why I thought that a philosopher was necessary.
Mr. Epstein, are you a scientist?
No, philosopher.
You're a philosopher?
Yes.
Okay. Well, this is the Environment and Public Works Committee. I think it's interesting we have a philosopher here talking about an issue.
It's to teach you how to think more clearly.
Well, you don't have to teach me how to think more clearly. You don't
I
have
think
to
I
try
do.
running.
So that, I did not have that planned, although I'm glad it worked out that way. But I was really, really serious. So I think of philosophy at its core as the science that teaches us to think about our thinking. You know, every day we think about things, we have opinions, but I think it's incredibly valuable to step back and to ask, are we really thinking about this in a way that makes sense? So to apply to this conference, you know, we talk about decarbonization and disruption, and transition. And one thing a philosopher asks is, well, are those really the right goals? And those questions might seem heretical, but those I think are the right kinds of questions to ask. Now, I mentioned when I was 20, I decided I wanted to become a philosopher. Initially, my goal was, I want to deal with the most practical issues. I want to help people think about the most practical issues that affect their lives. So I didn't want to go, even to grad school and become a professor. I wanted to be in the real world, helping people use philosophical thinking to make better decisions. Interestingly, for 7 years, even though I was obsessed with practical issues, I had no interest in energy. Even though I had a technical background, I went to supposedly like one of the top 10 high schools, one of the top 10 colleges in the country. The college is Duke University. But it had never really seemed to me that energy was that important. The only thing I'd really heard about it was that the leading source of energy, fossil fuels, was doing all of these bad things. But I didn't have a sense of it much beyond that. And I was randomly researching a project on the history of John D. Rockefeller, and I had a realization that may seem obvious, but I don't think it's something that we take seriously enough. And it is this. It's that energy is the industry that powers every other industry. So energy is the industry which powers every other industry, which means that energy is fundamental to what I call human flourishing, to human beings living to their fullest potential. So if you look at this chart, what we see is that energy consumption correlates extremely, extremely strongly with life expectancy, world population, so how many people the world can hold, and then GDP per capita, how much income we make. Now, correlations can be coincidental, but sometimes they can indicate there's some sort of cause and effect relationship. And the cause and effect relationship is this. Human beings normally, before modern industry, live in a manual labor civilization. And human beings are very weak. Thus, we can't get much work done, and thus we can't survive and flourish very well. So the big transition is going from a manual labor civilization to a machine labor civilization. And the key to a machine labor civilization is to have energy to power the machines. I think of this as machine calories. So the more calories we can give our machines, the better we can live. And once I realized this, it made me think, wow, energy is the issue that I'm most interested in thinking about and helping people with their thinking about. Because if we make a good decision about energy, it's incredibly leveraged. Like if you make energy cheaper and more plentiful and more reliable and safer, that's going to make every aspect of life better. It's going to make food cheaper, that's going to make clothing more plentiful, that's going to make housing better. And if you make a bad choice about energy, so maybe you think you're doing the right thing, but you make energy scarce or expensive or unreliable, you make everything worse. So I was really interested in how good is our thinking about energy. And it seemed to me that there were like two big ways we could be going wrong. One is we could be taking action to restrict forms of energy, and that would be a bad thing. Or we could allow certain forms of energy, and that would be a bad thing. I didn't know the facts, but that seemed very strong. And on the restriction side, I don't think this is taken serious enough, but it's a really popular view in the world that we should try to restrict 80% of CO2 emissions in the next 30 years or so by 2050. Like that is a very, very radical proposal, and it's the kind of thing that requires the most careful thinking. At the same time, continuing our use of hydrocarbons without looking into all the potential risks and side effects, that is irresponsible too. So I was really interested in, well, what is actually the truth about this? And when I started really following the conversation, I quickly thought that I really think that the conversation is fundamentally flawed. I think that the thinking is, to put it directly, like really, really bad in three ways. And I would describe those ways as I think that our thinking about energy, and I include smart people in this, and I include even people at this conference whom I like in this category. I think our thinking about energy tends to be very biased, very sloppy, and actually very anti-human. So very biased, very sloppy, and very anti-human. So I want to share with you how I came to this conclusion, because it's a strong conclusion, but I think if I'm right, it means that we really need to think about energy in a different way, because people in this room are trying to influence energy decisions, and if you influence them in the wrong way, you can do bad things, and if you influence them in the right way, you can do good things. So let's talk about bias. So one thing I noticed was that, for example, when people talked about different forms of energy, very consistently, when they talked about certain forms of energy, namely fossil fuels and nuclear, and sometimes hydro, they would mostly talk about negatives. And when they talked about other forms of energy, namely solar and wind, they would mostly talk about positives. So for example, if you take nuclear, this is a typical kind of statement about nuclear. So it's saying like nuclear is not safe, and people talk about, oh, nuclear is really unsafe, and you have lots of articles about the lack of safety of nuclear power. But then I wanted to look at, okay, well, what is the actual evidence? What sources of energy actually are the safest per unit of energy generated? And then it turns out nuclear is by far the safest form of energy ever created. And then I looked into physics, and it made a lot of sense as to why. So it seemed really unfair that we would talk about nuclear safety as this big issue, but we wouldn't talk about the greater safety issues from other technologies. I heard Elon Musk the other day on his conference call talk about how upset he was, how deaths from automation in self-driving cars are reported too much, and he said this is really unfair because you're not reporting the deaths from manual driving. And I thought that's a good point, but I think he and others need to apply this to everything. We really need to try to be as unbiased as possible. Another example where you see this come up is in something like wildlife issues. So people will say, well, I really hate oil because oil spills can hurt wildlife, and don't you remember Deepwater Horizon, and I can never tolerate that kind of seeing those birds die again. But then I look into the evidence, and well, I mean, wind turbines by their nature are like very, very good at killing birds. And that doesn't mean that they're bad necessarily, but that's just a fact about their nature. So if we claim to care about wildlife, we need to look at all the different technologies. We can't just look at the ones we're predisposed to dislike and say they're bad, and then the ones we're disposed to like and say they're good. Another issue is like groundwater from industrial processes. So we hear about fracking and groundwater, but we don't hear about the more dangerous practices involved in, say, mining for solar panels and wind turbines. So we don't hear. There's this systematic bias. Another one is with the CO2 issue. It's really important to look at the influence of CO2 on our world, but part of that is we have to be open to both potentially positive and potentially negative things, and there's very, very strong evidence that increasing the amount of CO2 has fertilized plants all around the world and has led to massive, massive global greening. This shows general changes in leaf area, including places where human beings are doing nothing but adding CO2. So plant growth really matters. So when we talk about CO2, we need to talk about this. It doesn't mean that it's decisive. It might be that the warming is a way bigger problem. But if we don't talk about it, we can't get to the right decision. Now, you might say, well, only kind of, yeah, some people are biased, but the really sophisticated people are not biased. And I think that's not true. I think that systematically our energy conversation is very biased against fossil fuels and nuclear. And I think the most egregious version of this is a term that is just routinely used to attack people who voice any support for fossil fuels, including me, which is the term climate change denier. So the people who support fossil fuels, including the people who think that decarbonization isn't the goal, that we should actually use more fossil fuels going forward, not less, I've looked into their viewpoints, and I know my own viewpoint. Almost in no case is their viewpoint, I deny that CO2 has any influence on the atmosphere, any warming influence. That's not the position. The position is that warming is a side effect of fossil fuels, and that side effect is far less significant in its impact on human life than the positives of fossil fuels. Now, you may not agree with this, but this is a completely coherent position to say that the positives of something outweigh the side effects. Just like with vaccines, people who support vaccines generally, such as me, we don't say vaccines have no side effects. We say that the positives of vaccines outweigh the side effects. So if I say that, and then somebody says, oh, you're a vaccine side effect denier, right? If you support vaccines, you're a vaccine side effect denier. That's exactly the same as calling a supporter of fossil fuels a climate change denier. And what we're saying when we frame the issue that way is that we're not even willing to talk about the positives of fossil fuels. The only thing that matters about fossil fuels is its potential side effects. And that is pure bias, and you cannot get to the right decision. And if to the extent CO2 is a big problem, you'll alienate a lot of honest people by not engaging with the full context. So this was a really big problem. I think it's a problem in the world. It was a problem for me even figuring out the truth, because if I know that most of these sources are systematically biased, how am I supposed to get at the truth? I was coming as a philosopher, but I felt like I needed to become an energy expert myself and engage with all the primary source data, because it was so hard to know it was actually true. So what I thought is the bias in this is not something incidental. It's systematic. And it's really part of the framework by which we think of energy. So I really like the term framework. It's a good term in philosophy, because just like a building has a framework, so that's the starting structure of the building. Every thought process has a framework. That's the starting structure of the thought. Like, what are the assumptions that you start your thinking with? And one of the assumptions that we start our thinking and discussion with is that it's okay to be biased as long as you're against fossil fuels and nuclear. Like, people are just very cavalier about that. They're not at all careful. It's okay to be biased as long as you're against fossil fuels and nuclear, and as long as you're for solar and wind. And that's a really, really bad piece of the framework. So one of my goals in my own thinking and in my own advocacy was to replace that and say, well, one of the principles that needs to frame our thinking and discussion is even-handedness. And so when I talk to people about energy, I talk about, would you agree that we need to look at the pros and cons of all our alternatives? And I think that's a really great way to start any conversation. Again, this is not a factual assertion about fossil fuels or nuclear, solar, and wind. It's a method assertion about how to think about it and how to talk about it. So the next big problem is sloppiness. So to keep the vaccine example going, if you're thinking about whether and how to vaccinate a child, you need to look at both the potential benefits and side effects, but you also need to look at them very precisely. You need to know how big are the potential benefits, how big are the potential side effects. Because it makes a big difference if the vaccine is life and death positive or it's negligible. And it makes a big difference if the side effects are full-blown autism or like mild things like a rash. And when people say, oh, vaccines have side effects, that's way too vague. We need to be very precise about that. And yet, unfortunately, in energy, we're incredibly imprecise. So let's take the concept of radiation with nuclear power. People just throw around, oh, radiation is dangerous, I'm afraid of radiation. But radiation is something that exists naturally, and it's the kind of phenomenon, like most things, that in certain quantities is perfectly healthy or even positive, or at the very least harmless, and then in certain quantities is negative. And the quantities that we're exposed to nuclear radiation in from power are basically all the time not a problem. And yet, because we're being sloppy, we act like, oh, because radiation allegedly caused a three-eyed fish on The Simpsons, or because in huge amounts it can hurt you, therefore all radiation is bad. And this is a horrible, horrible thinking and discussion, because what it's going to get us to do is exaggerate the negatives of nuclear power. But nuclear power has a lot of amazing positives, so if it's going to make us have the wrong kind of weighting on things. So we really, really need to be precise. I mentioned Elon Musk before. Here's where I'll criticize him on something. This is the kind of thing he says all the time in his speeches. He'll address things on the level of climate change is real. Like, climate change is real, therefore we need these radical restrictions on fossil fuels. But that is not helpful at all, because when I was looking into this issue, I didn't want to know, is climate change real, or do fossil fuels have any warming influence? What I want to know is, how significant is the influence so I can make decisions? So, for example, is it something that's going to lead to 20 feet of sea level rise in a couple decades, like Al Gore says in his movie, or is it something that we're talking more like 2 feet in 100 years, which is more like what you hear from the UN? Those make huge differences. And so one of the pieces of sloppiness in this is that when people talk about climate change, I think climate influence is a better way to think of it, because you're talking about the influence of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. They're very unclear about what the greenhouse effect is. I've asked even recognized energy experts, and they have no idea how the greenhouse effect actually works. The greenhouse effect that we can prove in a lab is what's called a diminishing or logarithmic effect. So it's something that every new molecule of CO2 has a warming influence, but each one warms less than the last. So all other things being equal, it's not something you would be particularly alarmed about. Now, the idea that some people have is in the atmosphere, it's compounded by other things, and that leads to extreme warming. But you can only even think about the issue coherently if you understand what the greenhouse effect is, and you can differentiate what's demonstrated versus what's more speculated, which are things like model projections. And yet people just say, oh, the greenhouse effect is real, you must be a climate change denier. So this is just garbage. Like, we cannot make decisions. It's the exact same thing in vaccines. You would make horrible decisions if you thought about vaccines the way you think about fossil fuels. Now, a version of the sloppiness on climate is something where people talk about, oh, unprecedented sea level rises. And you look at this as Wikipedia, which is, in my view, super biased against fossil fuels, but sea level record in the last 10, 20,000 years is pretty unequivocal. And we have really slow sea level rise compared to our ancestors. So it doesn't mean that we don't influence at all, but we need to look at that context. It's ridiculously misrepresentative to say, oh, we have unprecedented things. I mean, it's just sloppy, and it can't lead to the good decision. And again, even if there is a problem, you don't win over a lot of people in a long-term way by being sloppy and propagandistic. You would really level with them. Another version of sloppiness in the climate thing, and I'm mentioning so many climate examples because this is being used as the basis of so much policy making, and yet we're not thinking of it precisely, and so we cannot make the right decisions. When people say, oh, 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real, and then man-made and dangerous, like when you look into these studies, it's absolutely not that they even say it's man-made, and certainly not that they say it's dangerous. So you do have certain scientists who say this, but the way to handle that is to actually get clarity on what different scientists say and why, and what the different potential magnitudes are, not to just try to call people climate change deniers and lump them with Holocaust deniers. That's just really unfair, and it's going to lead to bad decisions. A final thing, and this comes up a lot, is when we talk about solar and wind, I think there's incredible sloppiness to kind of promote them. So one thing is, we use the term capacity a lot. Like people say, oh, there's a record amount of capacity. And yet the capacity of an uncontrollable and intermittent source is a completely different animal than the capacity of, say, a nuclear power plant, which you can control. So it's just completely dishonest to talk about one as if it's the same as the other. We need to be very upfront about how, okay, certain forms of energy are intermittent. So you see this graph of Germany, and that leads to a lot of challenges, and we have to look objectively at what is the actual ability to overcome those challenges, not just in a couple little examples, but on the scale of the world. And I just think that that story is not being told because there's this premise that it's okay to be biased and sloppy at the expense of fossil fuels and nuclear and for solar and wind. So again, we cannot make the right decisions. So framing principle number 2 in terms of our framework is precision. We can't be sloppy, we need to be precise. So we need to be committed to even-handedness and precision. Now there's a third problem with our thinking, which I think is the worst. And it's an answer to the question, why is it that our bias is so consistently against certain forms of energy? Why is it so consistently against fossil fuels, nuclear, and often hydro? Why is it almost never against solar and wind? So there must be a cause. It's not just like the New York Times randomly writes puff pieces on oil. Like that will never happen, or at least it won't happen for a while, right? It's always going to be a hit piece on oil and a puff piece on solar. That's generally what you can expect. So what is causing it? Now you might think, well, it's people are just so concerned about CO2. But if they were so concerned about CO2, what explains the opposition to nuclear and hydro? Because nuclear and hydro have in common, they are the only forms of non-carbon energy that can demonstrably provide reliable power for 100 million people or more. Like, we can talk about the hypothetical potential of solar wind, but in terms of things that are actually running a grid and that are actually seem to be able to do that, they are not actually doing that. Whereas if people say CO2 is an urgent challenge, how can you possibly be against nuclear and hydro? And I think the hydro example is really revealing. Because when you really push it and you say, well, if you say CO2 is the world's biggest problem, aren't you willing to dam a river? Like, even if that has some adverse consequences, aren't you willing to dam a river to save humanity from CO2? And basically say, no, free-flowing rivers take precedence. And what that means is that they are placing unchanged nature over human life. And I think the same thing goes on with nuclear. All the objections to nuclear, if you look at them empirically, they're not sound in terms of safety issues. What it really boils down to is people think there's something unnatural about splitting the atom and creating this kind of waste, even though we have ways of dealing with the waste. They just think there's something wrong. So really what's going on is, at the root, they think it's unnatural, we shouldn't do it, and thus they're placing unchanged nature over human life. And I think the same thing is going on with fossil fuels, where people think that us influencing the climate is inherently bad. I think it's bad if it's really bad for human life and if that is not outweighed by the positives of fossil fuels, but I think in general it's a great thing to influence climate. I mean, I would want to be able to neutralize Hurricane Harvey in the future. We do indoor climate change constantly with heating and air conditioning. That's amazing. This idea that change is bad or that unchanged nature is good, I think that's a really bad idea. And I think that is the core idea of our energy discussion. In philosophy, there's an issue called standard of good, which is how do you measure the right choice versus the wrong choice? When we talk about progress, how do we know what's leading to progress and what's not? And there's a question of what are we measuring it by? And in our discussion, what we usually measure it by is how green it is. Sometimes we say how renewable it is, but we usually exclude hydro from that. So it's really green, and green means unchanged nature. And I don't think about it that way. I don't think of what's the greenest energy, just like I don't choose medicines by what's the greenest medicine or cell phones by what's the greenest cell phone. I choose things by what's the best overall for human life. And if you take this idea of green seriously, like if we say we want to minimize our impact, well, historically, if we had wanted to minimize our impact, I think if Greenpeace had been around when we decided to turn a patch of dirt and trees into New York City, they would have given it a big thumbs down. And I think if the Sierra Club were advising my parents on whether to self-replicate 4 times with me and my 3 younger sisters, they would say no. The Sierra Club actually tells young women that if you have 1 child, your carbon legacy increases by a factor of 6. And we all are supposedly, the height of virtue is to minimize our CO2 emissions. And if we really believe in being green, then I think we have to acknowledge that North Korea is basically the greenest country in the world. Like, they've had almost no impact on nature, right? Like, the North Korean non-existent hotel, that's a lot greener than any of our hotels. So we have an idea that is telling us that we shouldn't make an impact, an idea that if we had followed it in the past would have restricted progress. And my view is that idea is going to restrict progress today. So I think the key thing that needs to change is we need to stop measuring things by how little we impact nature, including how little carbon we have. That's at most a piece of the puzzle, but it's not an end in itself to have low carbon. The end in itself is human flourishing. And I think because we do not think about things in terms of human flourishing, even really well-meaning people actually come to ideas that are not helping human life. And as one example, consider the fact that 3 billion people in the world have almost no energy, including over 1 billion with no electricity. And we talk about energy every day in the media, and nobody cares. Right? It's almost nobody mentions this issue of energy poverty. The fossil fuel companies have brought it to light a little bit, but it's almost never mentioned. But you know who we care about incessantly, much more than those 3 billion people, is polar bears. Like, we're obsessed with polar bears. I just saw a polar bear the other day. I love polar bears. I think they're just incredibly cool. But I think that it's still a really weird thing that we don't care about 3 billion people, and yet we're really upset about, oh, the polar bears are a little thinner, or they had to move from one piece of ice to another. Like, there's something really, really off with our priorities, and it's because we have the wrong standard. And the standard you use to judge good and bad, that determines what you focus on. And we focus on anything we do to change nature, we're obsessed with, and we want to stop. And yet we're not looking at all the opportunities to improve human flourishing, including giving 3 billion more people ample energy. So the framing principle number 3 is that we have to be really clear on our standard, and I believe it should be human flourishing, not unchanged nature. So one application of this that you might find useful in thinking about it is, I don't think about climate change, because I don't think change is inherently good or bad. I think about climate livability. And to look at climate livability, you have to look at all the impacts of fossil fuels on climate, including the effects of CO2 on greening, and also the effects of having a lot more energy and protecting ourselves from climate. And one thing I found in researching my work, which was really surprising to me, is that we've actually made the climate way, way safer using fossil fuels. Because it turns out that the biggest cause of climate livability is not kind of relatively small changes in temperature. It is whether we have enough industry and technology to protect ourselves from the naturally dangerous climate. So we've actually gone from millions of climate-related deaths a year from floods and storms and heat and cold in the 30s to thousands today. And nobody tells that story because they assume that we're making climate worse because we're changing it a little bit. But I think overall, we're making it way better. Now, you may disagree with that, or you don't have access to those facts, so I'd invite you to just, at the end, I'll tell you where to get some more resources on this. But I hope that you can agree that it's really important to have a framework that's based on human flourishing, where we're really clear this is what we're after. We want more human flourishing in the world. And to get there, we're going to look at all our options with even-handedness and with precision. And I think that's really a framework that can unite us, even if we have, I'm not from any particular industry, but I'm known for being pro-fossil fuels, and to some extent I'm known for being pro-nuclear, but we should really be united around, we're really in this to help human life get better. We're not here because we think a Tesla is inherently great or not. We're here because we want things that improve human life. But if we really want that, we have to make human flourishing our standard all the time, and we have to be very even-handed and precise all the time. Because we can always do good if we think well, but we can do bad if we think badly. And one of my big fears in life is being like the people in the past generations who supported really bad things. Like, people just like us historically have supported really bad things and really good things. And the only way I know to make sure, to maximize the chances that I'm supporting something that gets properly viewed in the past as good, is if I have a framework that I know is going to lead me in a pro-human direction. So today, this is the beginning, at least for this audience, of inviting you to join the human flourishing movement. And the key idea of the movement is that energy progress needs a clear guiding principle, and that principle should be human flourishing. So energy progress requires a clear guiding principle, and that principle should be human flourishing. Now, in terms of next steps, there's a card at your seat, and so it just says get resources. The most important thing is if you're interested in resources to help you get clearer on how to think about things in terms of human flourishing, and also how to increase your influence, so how you can spread these ideas to others, that's what we have a list for, which will just give you tons and tons of free resources on this. One favor I would ask, if you find this human flourishing perspective interesting, I think you'll agree that it's not enough present in the world. So if you can think of any other high-level events like this, where you think I would be a good speaker and you could connect me, that would be terrific. So at the bottom of it, you'll see that there's 3 blanks, and so if you have any ideas that you could connect me to, that's really one of the big ways I spread the message. There's also a box you can check if you yourself have an event, but I really, really appreciate these kinds of intros. So again, if you take one sentence away, it's that energy progress requires a clear guiding principle, and that principle should be human flourishing. Thank you.